Good morning, Priscilla. Really, I want you to put this video on at night before you go to bed, so I read my story to you at night. Since I never got a chance to read a book to you, so this will be a story, The Value of Love, the story of Johnny Appleseed. So here we go. Once upon a time, so long ago that most of our country was still a wilderness, a little boy was busy growing up in a tiny, crowded cabin in a small but bustling community in Massachusetts. The boy's name was Johnny Chapman, and of course, everyone called him Johnny. And even when he was very young, he wasn't quite like other boys. He's given to wondering and dreaming, said the neighbors. What a restless child, like as not Mistress Chapman will have her troubles with that lad. But Johnny's stepmother paid no attention to the gossip. Johnny's a loving boy, she said to herself as she watched him with the little brother and sister. There's no one better to rock a cradle or sing a lullaby. Johnny was a willing boy, too. He was always ready to run to the woodpile and bring back logs for the fire, or to scamper to the well when his stepmother needed a pail of water. True, the boy was a dreamer, so he had his troubles with the schoolmaster, but on the whole, he got along well enough. And before he was very old, he had learned to do his sums and to read his Bible. And it turned out that reading the Bible was a thing Johnny dearly loved to do. When he wasn't in school or at his chores or helping with the newest baby in the family, Johnny liked to go off into the woods by himself. He would sit under a tree and read the Bible out loud. Strangely enough, the animals sometimes came to listen. Then Johnny would leave off reading and he would start to tell them what it was like in heaven and how surely even the squirrels and badgers must have a place there, for did the Lord make them all? The birds sat on the low branches just above Johnny's head and they listened. The rabbits crept close to Johnny's feet. Sometimes a young deer stalked out of the forest and stood staring at the dark haired boy with the big book. One especially fine autumn afternoon, when the sun was warm in the
Yes.
clearing, a jay flew down and perched on Johnny's shoulder. It made a noisy, shattering, scolding sound, as jays often do. Then it flew up and away and was gone. A raccoon was washing a crawfish in the stream nearby. He looked around as the jay flew off. I think, said the raccoon, that the bird was trying to tell you something. I guess he was telling me goodbye, said Johnny softly. It was time for him to fly south before the snow comes. Then Johnny suddenly realized that he was sitting there having a chat with a raccoon. While it is true that Johnny often talked to animals, he was more than a bit startled to hear one talk back to him, and in his own language. My name is Randy, said the raccoon. I've been watching you for quite a while. I'd like to be your friend. I don't suppose you mind having a furry friend, would you? Now, deep down in his heart, Johnny knew that raccoons talked in raccoon talk and not in plain, ordinary English. He knew he had made up Randy, but he needed a friend who would understand how it was with him, how he liked to wander by himself and dream big dreams of exploring the land that lay to the west of Massachusetts. It was wild land. The forest grew so thick that someone who walked under the tree might think it was twilight all day long. So when Johnny set out for home, he took Randy with him. And when he came in sight of the cabin where he lived, it was swarming with youngsters and there was a wagon out in front. It's Paul, cried Johnny. He, he's come home from his trip. Johnny began to run, for he loved his father very much. Next to the times when he was in the woods, he liked the times he was with his father's carpenter shop watching Nathaniel Chapman make bows and churns and spice boxes for the good folks in the settlement up and down the state. When you get when you get a mite bigger, his father always told him, you can come with me to help sell my wooden ware. Johnny wasn't quite big enough yet, so that day he just helped his father unhitch the old horse from the wagon and led it into the barn. Maybe when I go in the springtime, said Johnny's father, you can come with me. Then Mr. Chapman went into the house. Randy the raccoon watched while Johnny rubbed the horse down with handfuls of straws. You're a good old boy, said Johnny, and, and he kissed the horse on the nose. Next spring, he said, next spring I can go with Paul. Johnny held the thought of Johnny held the thought all during that autumn. While the apples ripe on the tree, he helped with the picking that year, and he saw his stepmother string up the apples up in the kitchen to dry, so there would be applesauce during the winter. Some of the apples went into the cellar, where they would be kept better. They would be baked into pies, and the apples that fell on the ground were taken to a mill, where the pulp was pressed and the juice ran out to make apple cider. Was anything ever as good as apples? Said Johnny. I think the Lord must have put them on earth to give us joy. Of course he did, said Randy the raccoon. And since Johnny was always told him that the Lord loved everybody the same, Randy helped himself to a nice red apple from Johnny's basket. When winter comes, the spinning wheel in Chapman's cabin hummed and the weaving loom thumped. Johnny's stepmother was making clothes. New clothes for you, Johnny, she said. You can't go about in rags like a scarecrow. Johnny loved his stepmother, and he was grateful for the new clothes she made for him. He tried to keep himself tidy and to remember to comb his hair. But Johnny's mind was never really on how he looked. At night, when Johnny and Randy climbed into their bed in the loft over the cabin, Johnny whispered his dream to Randy. The trip with Paul will be just the beginning, he said. Someday I'm going to travel west, way out to Ohio, where the land is still new. When I'm old enough to carry a gun, then I can go. Old enough to carry a gun? Cried Randy. Can this be the John Chapman who reads the Bible to the forest friends? The one who climbs, the one that claims that the Lord loves everybody the same. Don't you think your fellow creatures have just as much right to live as you do? Johnny thought about these words all during the long winter, and he decided Randy was right. I'll never carry a gun, he resolved. I'll never shoot a living thing. Spring came, and it was time for Johnny to set out with his father to sell the wooden ware. Johnny was thrilled. He had never before been away from his home. Of course, Randy was with him, and so he and Johnny both saw the family of pioneers on the road near Springfield. The pioneers had a great Conestoga wagon and a team of oxen. They had a pile of household goods and supplies aboard the wagon. But they weren't going anywhere when Johnny and Randy saw them. They were simply standing in the meadow beside the road, looking up at the pink blossom on the apple trees. They look so sad, said Johnny to Randy. Don't they know that going west will be a great venture? They know, said Randy. They just have to say goodbye to the things they're leaving behind, like apple trees. No apple trees in the wilderness? Asked Johnny. No apple trees in the wilderness, said Randy. Only forest trees like beech and oak and fir. And those trees that have to crowd each other just to get room to grow. Johnny thought about this, and his heart was heavy. No apple trees blooming in the springtime, no fruit growing through the warm summer. No fresh apples to eat in the fall, no cider, no apple butter or applesauce in the long, hard winter. Johnny felt a great surge of love and pity for the pioneer family. No apples, said he in a small, sad voice as he watched them out in their wagon. You have to give up something if you want to make your way in the new land, said Randy. Someday I'll do something about that, declared Johnny. I'll see that no one has to give up apples. In the years that followed, Johnny often went with his father and helped sell the wooden ware, and Randy went along and watched Johnny grow. And when he was strapping lad in his teens, Johnny set out to work on his own. Can you guess what he did? He hired himself out to a man who knew everything there was to know about orchards. And when Johnny worked for that man, he didn't he did not do any daydreaming. He paid attention. Soon he knew how deep to plant an apple seed. He knew how much to water the warm earth so that the seeds would sprout. He learned how to tend the orchards once they started and to set the young trees far enough apart from one another. He learned to prune the trees, and he learned that if he wanted to move a tree, he would have to wrap the roots well in wet moss so that they wouldn't dry out. When he was 18, Randy felt that he was ready. Nathaniel, he said to his younger brother, come springtime, I'm setting out to Olin. That's that's way off in the western part of New York State. Paul's brother Ben lives there. Want to come along? Now there was no very good reason for Johnny to take Nathaniel along. The boy was only 11. Can't think why I'm doing it, said Johnny to Randy. Because the boy's fond of you and he wants to go, said Randy. You love him too, or am I much mistaken? Johnny did love his brother. So when April came, he and Nathaniel said goodbye to their folks. Mr. Chapman read a special verse out, out of the Bible, and he asked the Lord to look after his two boys. Johnny felt a twinge of loneliness, for it was no small thing to leave the people he held dear. You'll be fine, his father said his father. You're a good lad, and you're bound to do well. Now, if the farmland in the West is as rich as people say, send word and we'll come. Johnny promised that he would, and he and Nathaniel set out with Randy scampering along beside. The boys went on foot, and everywhere he looked, Johnny saw the forest trees growing tall, shutting out the sky. It would be welcome to see an apple tree instead, he said. There should be clearing and orchards in them. I have a feeling that there will be clearings, said Randy. He didn't particularly object to forestry, although he liked orchards as well as anyone's. After a long, long journey, Johnny and Nathaniel and Randy reached Olin, and they had a surprise. What do you think it was? The cabin where Ben Chapman had settled for years before was empty. What a disappointment, said Randy. I bet your uncle's gone to the new land around the Ohio River. Why don't you rest for a bit and then go after him? What Randy said made good sense to Johnny, perhaps because when he listened to Randy, he was really listening to his own good sense. We'll need supplies, he said, so we'll have to get work, but we can do it. Johnny surely could do it. He knew so much about planting and pruning that a farmer in Olin was glad to hire him. That fall, when the apple crop was harvested, Johnny drove a wagon loaded with apples to the cider mill. When the apples were ground to a pulp and the cider was pressed out, Johnny saw that there was apple seeds everywhere around the mill. Each one is really an apple tree just waiting to find its place in the earth so it can grow. He told Randy it's a shame to let seeds go to waste. Johnny gathered up every seed that he could. He washed the seeds and dried them and put them in a sack. And from that day on, Johnny never threw away an apple seed. The next spring, Johnny and Nathaniel and Randy set out on their travels again. Their uncles had talked of farming the land near Marietta in Ohio. The boys had decided to look for them there. Sometimes they traveled with pioneer families. Then Johnny helped drive the great wagons. Sometimes they walked. Sometimes they went by water, for the river were like highways in the unsettled land. To use the river roads, the boys needed a canoe, and Johnny was skilled at making dugouts. He and Nathaniel first chopped a hole in a fallen log. Then he built a fire in the hole to hollow the log out so that it would float upright. Say what you like, said Randy, but pioneering isn't a life for lazy folks. Lazy folks can't sit at home and let moss grow on them. Johnny laughed. Nathaniel and I, we aim to see the green land that's out west, and it is fine country for farming. I'll send word to Paul just as I promised. Johnny and Nathaniel would be off in their dugouts when Randy riding in the prow, watching the river for whirlpools or shallows that might upset them. Time and again, as they went along, Johnny talked about how grand the forest would look had cleared, when they had clearing in them, and homestead and apple trees growing in the clearing. An apple orchard that planted properly and pruned with love, why it will live and bless people for most of 100 years, he told Randy. Johnny and Nathaniel came to Marriott at last. They found Ben Chapman in the town on the market day. Uncle Ben was so delighted to see his brother's boys and to hear that his brother might come too and settle in the rich land along the Ohio that he danced and jigged right there in the streets. My goodness, said Randy, what a whooping and welcoming, the likes of which I've never seen. That man's right glad to see kinfolk way out here on the frontier. The boys sent words to their father that the land near Marietta was very fine. Back in Massachusetts, Nathaniel Chapman made plans for the long trek west with his family. He would settle on Duck Creek near Marietta, and he would be happy there. But for Johnny, there would be no settling. He was as restless as when he tramped the woods as a boy. It's time I began my life's work, he said to Randy. You'll need tools, said Randy, who knew quite well what Johnny's life work would be. A shovel, an axe, and a hoe. Johnny nodded. And I'll need my Bible. You plan to preach to the animals some more? Asked Randy. Why not? Said Johnny. That's how I met you, but I'll find people to read the Bible with me. Wait and see. So Johnny tucked his good book into his shirt. By now he had a sack bursting with apple seeds, and he slung this onto his shoulder together. With a sack filled with cornmeal, he picked up his tools, and since he had no other place to put his cooking pot, he wore it on his head, and a very fine hat it was. And Johnny at last began his real wandering. For a while he worked in the western Pennsylvania. He had his nursery there with thousands of tender young trees, and he would always come back there, never passing a cider mill without searching through the post for seeds. But it was the unbroken wilderness that really drew Johnny. He thought of the pioneers who would come after him. He thought how delighted they would be to see apple trees. He thought of the children and how they would climb the trees in the autumn and crunch the ripe apples in their teeth. Johnny's clothes wore out and his shoes went to pieces, and he didn't care. He trotted through Ohio, preparing the earth, planting seeds, watering his orchards, and tending them. When he finished, he moved on to do it again in some new places. He was a loving friend to his little trees. However, he always came back to them. When they were 2 years old, they had to be replanted so that there would be enough distance between them. Johnny always saw to this. Then he pruned them and fused over them and fussed over them like a kind father fussing over his beloved children. Sometimes Johnny gave his trees away. If a man was poor and if he had children to feed and a wife whose life needed some joy in it, there would be trees from Johnny. The children could play under the bow in the summer, and could run to gather the windfall when they began to come down with the autumn wind. Sometimes Johnny sold the trees. He needed to eat just like anyone else. If a settler had money and could pay, Johnny got a good price for his trees. And what did he do with this money? Well, of course, a bit of it went for cornmeal, for Johnny Chapman was mighty fond of corn pone. Indeed, he almost lived on it. That and apples. But cornmeal doesn't cost that much. Johnny did something else with his money. Can you guess what it was? He bought animals with it, horses and mules and oxen that couldn't pull heavy burdens along the road trails anymore. Johnny loved them just the way he loved children and apple trees. If he heard of a horse being abused or abandoned, he bought it, then gave it to some farmer who would be kind to it. That's what Johnny did with his money. Sometimes Johnny would plant an orchard on the land of a man who needed trees. Now, half of these trees are yours, he would tell the delighted settler, but half of them are mine, and I may be sending for them. Johnny would wait then until he met a farmer with a half a dozen children hungering for the taste of an apple, and a wife who hadn't seen apple blossom since she was a bride. Johnny would give the farmer a slip of paper. It's an order for some trees, he would say. You take it to Jabez Higgins down on the turnpike, and he'll let you have 20 young saplings. That's the way Johnny sent for his trees. Soon Johnny was known all through the frontier. He seemed that no matter how far west the settlers pushed, he had been there before them, and strange tales were told about him. They said that the woods came snuffling around the campfire at night when he sat eating his corn pone, and they never harmed him. They said he called himself brothers to the bear, and that he could understand the crows when they chattered to one another about the doings of the forest creatures. Whether the tales are true or not, no one ever knew for sure. Johnny did not talk much of his own affairs, but one thing is certain. When he came striding out of the woods with his cooking pot on his head and his sack of apple seeds on his back, the children all ran out to greet him. Johnny Appleseeds, they cried. Here comes Johnny Appleseed. Hello, Johnny. The settlers always made a great fuss about Johnny. He was welcome in every cabin, and he had the best place by the fire. The children gathered close, and as he ate his corn pone and apple fritters and wild honey. When, when he had eaten, he read verses from the Bible, and then he told the news. They were starved for news from they were starved for news on the frontier, for talk of the important things that were happening far away in the east, in the Washington, where the great men of government lived. Not that Johnny ever got to Washington or anywhere near it. He didn't. But he met people on the trail and the turnpikes who did, and he passed their news along to the settlers. When the serious questions of news was taken care of, Johnny might spin a few yarns of his own. The children always laughed when he told about the boy who caught a fish so big that he had to carry it over his shoulder while his tail dragged on the ground. He had a fish fry that lasted 3 days, and when it was done, he sold the bones to a keelboat skipper to use for an oar. Johnny Appleseed knew the Indians as well as he knew the white settlers. From them he learned the art of making medicine and soothe burns, and of brewing herb teas to cure sickness. And the Indians respected him, for he was a peaceful man. Just because he was peaceful, Johnny was troubled when bad feelings arose between the Indians and the white settlers. The Indians resented it when the white people took over their land. As Johnny went his way with his tools and his apple seeds, he saw that the Indians were preparing for war. He heard them speak of white men with hatred. There would be fighting, said Randy one evening as he sat with Johnny beside a campfire. The birds talked about it in the trees, and the squirrels tell the scene a war party on the north. Johnny Appleseed, what will you do if there is war between your red brothers and your white ones? It was a hard question. It made Johnny's heart heavy. I will do whatever I can to stop it, he decided. But I will not lift a hand against anyone red or white. Soon after, Johnny saw Indians wearing their war paints. Their faces were stern and angry. It happened. It's happening, whispered Randy. They're going to attack the settlers' cabin. The stockade in Mansfield isn't far away, said Johnny. I'll warn the settlers they can go to the stockade, which the Indians won't be so quick to attack. Johnny began to run, and for once in his life, he didn't worry about apple seeds. If some spilled out of his sack, he never noticed. He raced from cabin to cabin. The Indians are getting ready to attack, he cried. Hurry, drop everything, run to the stockades. The settlers raced to the stockades, and when the Indians came whooping down on the cabins, they found emptiness. There was one there was no one to fight them. There was no killing. The settlers were safe for the moment, but they wouldn't be safe for long. There weren't enough of us to stand off an attack if the Indians bring more warriors, said one man inside the stockade. Besides, we can't stay here forever. We're short of food and water. Someone has to go to the front of Mount Vernon and bring back soldiers. But Mount Vernon was a small settlement 30 miles away. The settlers thought for the journey through dense wood and across half cleared land, and their heart went cold. Then Johnny Appleseed spoke up. He had been standing quietly near the gate with the cooking pot on his head. I'll go, he said. If it will save a single life, I'll go. He set out right away. He traveled all day and all night. He never seemed so he never seemed too hurried, yet he covered the ground quickly. The Indians saw him, and they let him pass unharmed. He was a peaceful man, and they could not think of him as their enemy. The soldiers at Mount Vernon were terribly excited when they heard of the settlers in trouble at Mansfield. They ran to get their weapons and to check their ammunition. ammunition. But we'll need someone to guide us, said one officer to Johnny. Can you show us the way to Mansfield? Johnny groaned a weary groan. You can do it, whispered the little friend Randy. Rest for a while and you'll feel strong again. Johnny nodded. Give me an hour and some food and water, he told the officer. Then I'll be ready to set out. After an hour, Johnny was ready, and again he walked for a day and a night through the forest. When the soldiers arrived at Mansfield, the Indians' attack had already begun. The men from Mount Vernon charged into the fight with blazing guns, and the Indians fled. But when the smoke cleared, Johnny Appleseed was gone too. He had done all he could to keep the peace, but when the fighting broke out, anyways, he vanished into the woods. Fortunately, the hard times on the frontier did not last forever. Peace came again, and once more Johnny was seen in the settlements with the apple seeds. Again, he tended the trees and stopped at the farms to visit with the children. And so the years went by. Johnny's black hair turned gray, and the children he dandled on his knees when he visited the homestead in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. Why, they were the children and the grandchildren of the youngsters he met on the trail when he was a young man himself. We're getting old. Do you know that, Johnny Appleseed? Said his friend Randy. A man's bound to if he lives long enough, declared Johnny. One spring day, Johnny was tending his trees in the land near Fort Wayne in Indiana. There had been a late snow that year, wet and heavy, and it took all of Johnny's love and faith to remember that soon the land would be filled with pink sweetness of apple blossom. Strange, said Johnny. I feel a kind of weirdness in my heart. I think I'll sit down for a spell and rest. Then he and Randy sat together under one of the trees. A farmer found Johnny there. He was hot with a fever. The man took him home to a simple shack he sometimes used when he was in the neighborhood. He gave Johnny herbs, teas, and some of other remedies that Johnny had once given him, but it wasn't any use. Johnny Appleseed died last night, said the farmer to his neighbors the next day. He went just as peacefully as he lived. Maybe he maybe he thinks there are apples in heaven, said one of the neighbors. And who's to say there aren't? Asked his wife. The word was passed from village to village. Johnny Appleseed had died quietly as he did everything else. He was taken sick while sitting under one of his own trees. He was 71 years old. That might be the end of Johnny's story, except that the people just plain couldn't forget him. Not good old gentle Johnny, with his sack of apple seeds and his wonderful stories. Not Johnny, with his kind hand on the brow of sick child. Not Johnny, who loved red apples and white so much that he wouldn't fight either of them, though he'd walk 30 miles through the wilderness and 30 miles back to save both from harm. And so Johnny Appleseed became a legend. Johnny had walked with love all his life, the love he felt for every creature that lived on earth. The love lasted even after he was gone. Today, there are schools named after Johnny Appleseed. Parks and gardens and orchards have been laid out and planted in his honor. No doubt they would please Johnny, and surely it would please him to sit in one of his orchards and watch the sun come golden through the leaves. No doubt he would like to have a child or two close to him to listen to his tales. It was the trees growing and the children's gathering near him that made him happiest all of his life long. The frontier days are over now, and unless you plan to plant apple trees on the moon, you can't do exactly what Johnny did, but you can think about your own life and about the people you love. You may want to find a way to show that love and perhaps to be more loving to more people. If you do, chances are that your love will be returned. And when you give love and receive it, you may find that you're a happier person, just like your good old friend, Johnny Appleseed. This is for you, Priscilla. I'm sure that everybody's gonna see this, so I want to say hi to the whole family. I love you guys, and Priscilla, I know that I have never read a book to you, and you were born when I was locked up, and I can't change the past. I can only plan for our future together, and this is our seed of planning our life together. I love you, and I can't wait to be out there and make our life better. And I know it's been hard and long, and I love you. And take care, and always read the Bible, and reading is good for us. I love you. Hope to see you guys soon. Bye.